heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thine kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Announcements by Your Honor the President.
Honourable Senators, I received a letter from the Speaker of the Australian Capital Territory Legislative Assembly, and it reads as follows. Dear Mr. President, transition to a republic. I'd like to share with you both my very good wishes to you and your members on the occasion of Barbados' transition to a republic. Becoming a republic is a significant step in a country's post-colonial journey and an exciting constitutional development. It is heartening to know that you will also remain an active member of the Commonwealth family of nations. With best wishes for this momentous new era in Barbadian history, yours sincerely, Joy Birch, MLA, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly for the Australian Capital Territory and acting CPS Small Branches Chair. Senators, I have excuses as follows. Excuses for absence from Senator Dr. Holder and Senator Moore, and indications of late arrival from Senators Franklin, Drakes, and Tate.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
Senator Walcott.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the Barbados Port Inc. Annual Report 2019-2020.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate moved by minister.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Orders 45-2 and 22-1 for the remainder of today's sitting to allow us to complete our work today. Thank you.
The question is that the standing order so mentioned be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Introduction of the
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the National Vending Bill 2021, and I also beg to move the first reading of the Facilitation of International Maritime Traffic Bill 2021.
The question is that the bills so mentioned be read a first time. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 5. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the National Vending Bill 2021.
Senator, the Most Honorable Mr. Jerome Walcott.
Mr. President, is that right to move the second reading of this very important bill? Mr. President, as I rise to move the second reading of this very important bill, I think all honorable senators will be mindful that when our Prime Minister addressed the nation on Tuesday morning, she indicated that the vending bill, the passage of the vending bill, it would be the first bill passed in our new republic. And hence, here we are debating it this morning. The bill speaks in its objects and reasons, Mr. President, about the regulation of vending in Barbados and the protection of the rights of vendors. And Mr. President, at the outset, I want to say that vending plays an integral part in every urban economy globally. There's no doubt about that. In terms of research in Accra and Ghana, over 20% of the urban population is said to be involved in vending. In parts of South Africa, this is as high as 15%. And in countries far afield as India, Vietnam, Peru, they speak of 10%. And globally, 2 to 5% of urban populations are involved in vending. In Barbados, we have, I don't know that the exact figures are available, I certainly don't have them, but ours is an interesting past. And indeed, Sir Hilary Beckles is quoted as saying that vending, and I quote, the mother of all black economic enfranchisement in Barbados, in that was the way how blacks coming out of slavery and after emancipation started to earn a living and provide for their families. Historically in Barbados, ours has not been necessarily a pleasant history for vendors. In those days and earlier days, before independence, there was the issue of the merchant and the elite class who saw vendors as nuisances and probably and that should be removed from the streets and affecting their businesses. Ironically, post-independence, though it was a slightly different merchant class to a large extent, this continued, this feeling about vending. And of course, it was transmitted to the wider society, where some persons saw vending in Barbados as just persons blocking the sidewalk, being abusive, having their surroundings untidy, and causing confusion. But Mr. President, there is no doubt that vending is very important in all societies. It provides job opportunities for persons who otherwise would have been unemployed, and it allows them to provide for their families and provides a sort of social safety net for these families. Without this vending in many of the societies, including ours, there would be large segments of persons, destitute persons. There will be severe poverty, and so it plays a very important role. It also helps the consumers, by allowing them to access goods and sometimes services at affordable prices, and indeed cheaper prices than the larger business concerns. It also provides benefits to those farmers and craftsmen from which they purchase their goods and vegetables, whatever it may be. And importantly, Mr. President, it allows for the circulation of money among poor people, in that you buy from vendors and they interact among themselves, as opposed to the upward pyramid of spending, where you spend in companies and it goes upwards externally to replenish stock, and also when profits are sent abroad. And of course, it allows consumers the ability to negotiate prices and to get prices that are more useful. Mr. President, I know you're well aware of this. I know that you had a habit of going to Oystins and negotiating prices, not only for fresh produce, but trying to get prices that suited your pocket.
Indeed, Senator Walker.
Mr. President, vending also brings, as I said earlier, benefits to customers, not only in terms of prices, but also in terms of selection, but in terms of the times that vendors can operate. Some of them operate very early, 4:30, 5 o'clock. People can get fresh produce. And also location. Rather than having to travel long distances, they're convenient in terms of where they are located. And over time, members of the populace develop relationships with specific vendors who keep things for them, who know that they might want this, they might want that. They might be keeping tomatoes for a certain person, and they build this relationship historically with these persons, which doesn't occur, obviously, in the larger commercial activities. Obviously, this not only in terms of acquiring produce, but some of the consumers find that as an opportunity to interact and see persons that they hadn't seen for a while. They meet at these vendors' stalls and these vendors' markets. So it brings that. And of course, in large cities, I don't know that people will say so about Barbados as yet. Perhaps this legislation is aimed at that. It brings a vibrancy and a life to those cities where you see people interacting with all sorts of vendors, cultural activities, food being sold. And this is something I believe that we will look to in the future. I am not going to stand here and say that there are all positives and everything is fine with vending. There are issues. There are the matters of blocking the sidewalks from time to time. And it is hoped that with this legislation, this matter will be addressed. Sometimes there's a lack of cleanliness, and this will have to be addressed. This occurs. Some vendors can be abusive, and sometimes they're quarreling and noisy among each other. And of course, at the end of the day, there's still the accusations of members of the public being swindled. I said accusations. I'm not in a position to say if it is in fact so. The good thing about vending in Barbados thus far, though, one of the positive things, is that we already have a cooperative, Barvin, and we've seen the strides that have been made in collaboration and cooperation with the government in establishing the vendors facility off the highway. And I think these are things going along with the new legislation that will seek to improve vending and make it viable in Barbados, recognizing the important role it plays to the socio-economic development of this country. Mr. President, this vending bill is based on a national vending policy which was developed and approved by Cabinet in 2020, I believe it is, the national vending policy. And obviously this formed the basis for the development of the legislation. And by way of background, it was felt that in terms of the policy that we needed to build out our national entrepreneurial ecosystem. In reading, I came across an interesting phrase where vending was described as an entrepreneurial laboratory, where all sorts of developments could come out in terms of businesses. And so the policy sees that as part of the process, to realize a wider vision of providing greater opportunity for all citizens to share in this upward socioeconomic mobility. It saw vending as a catalyst for economic enfranchisement of a large segment of the population that otherwise would have been excluded. And it saw that we needed to decriminalize all aspects of vending in Barbados so that the cycle of negativity, where vendors feel that they're harassed and they're chased by police and otherwise surrounding vending, that this whole negativity would be broken and the stigma associated with this very important activity would be gradually removed. Therefore, in developing the vending policy, vending is seen as being a laudable profession and not an occupation reserved for those who have not been successful academically. It is also said that it needs to look at advancing Barbadian heritage and culture and strengthening the connection between commerce, culture, and economy. and that in terms of vending, this provides the perfect avenue, recommending that there needs to be closer linkages between the vending sector, the tourism sector, agribusiness, and indeed creative industries. Therefore, as I said, it is the overriding objective is therefore to legitimize vending and create an enabling environment that will allow vendors to operate, to grow, and to create wealth, free of harassment and marginalization, while ensuring that they indeed adhere to the laws of the country. Mr. President, the policies sees it being a framework that forms a basis for decent work by offering vendors an opportunity for work that is productive and that will deliver a fair income, that will while promoting health and safety in the work environment, not only in terms of tidiness and hygiene, but also recognizing that vendors will have to have some talks on health care, remembering that vendors lift large boxes and stuff like this, and they need to pay attention not only in terms of their surroundings, but in terms of their own anatomical and physical structure and their backs and how they lift stuff and things like this. And indeed that the whole framework will provide social protection for families through helping them in terms of personal development. Mr. President, specifically, the objectives of the policy speak to bringing order to this entire structure through a consolidated and collaborative approach involving the government, vendors, and the business sector. And indeed, this has already started as it relates to the example of vending. I spoke already of decriminalizing vending and giving vendors a rightful place in the economic landscape of Barbados. The policy spoke also to protecting the rights and enhancing the morale of vendors. I spoke earlier about protecting their health and safety and facilitating and promoting best practices among vendors to include good hygienic practices and promotion of good standards of produce. I said I also see vending as having leading eventually to the successful micro-enterprises and indeed larger operatives, and allowing for vertical development by allowing vending to develop economically as a viable business choice and capable of moving to the next level. And we've seen examples indeed in Barbados of this historically. Mr. President, obviously the policy and the legislative framework will provide an opportunity for these persons to grow and develop their entrepreneurial talents, and concomitantly lead to a reduction in poverty in these areas, crime, and of course severe pressure on our stretched social services, as well as reducing unemployment. As I said earlier, allows flexible working hours so that vendors can move effectively, and indeed it can become an integral part of a cluster process where vendors can come together and form committees and provide larger businesses. Mr. President, in terms of the bill itself, it's fairly straightforward. Part 1 deals with the title and interpretation in Clause 2. Clause 3 explains what is vending and what is not vending. It speaks in, and I'm not going to be detailed in this because the bill is there. Part 3 speaks to the regulation of vending activities. It tells you in Clause 5 the process of application for a license. Clause 6 tells you about vending licenses. 7 tells you about the register of vendors which will be kept. Clause 8 speaks to revocation, suspension, or variant of a license. And of course, Clause 9 speaks to notice having to be given of intention to revoke, suspend, or vary a license. Clause 10 speaks to occasional vending, that is not on a beach, an esplanade, or in a garden. And Clause 11 speaks to occasional vending which is in those specific areas which I just mentioned. Part 4 speaks of the various vending zones. It speaks of the designation of vending zones. It speaks to public markets and fish landing sites and how they fit into the entire process. And Part 5 speaks to the rights and obligations of vendors. Clause 18 speaks to the general obligation of vendors. So 17 speaks to their rights, but then 18 speaks in detail to the obligations of the vendors. Part 6 speaks to the relocation and eviction of vendors, and this clause 5 speaks to the seizing and reclaiming of goods. There's to be an establishment of a national vending committee to coordinate and regulate the entire process, and this is outlined in terms of the composition and at part 7 and in clause 21. Mr. President, part 8 speaks to the appeal process, and clause 24 speaks to the National Vending Appeal Tribunal to deal with the matters of appeals. And of course, the other clauses speak to the power of the tribunal, the right of appeal to the High Court, the administrative penalties, and indeed the procedure for challenging an alleged administrative contravention at clause 30. Mr. President, with these few words, I beg to move that this important bill be now read a second time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator, Most Honorable Dr. Walcott. Senator Wiggins.
Good morning to the chamber, and thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the opportunity to speak for the first time since Barbados transitioned to a new republic. I also want to publicly congratulate the Most Honorable Mr. Jerome Walcott on his national achievement for all the work he has done, not only with our Foreign Affairs Department, but obviously being head of the Cabinet COVID-19 subcommittee meeting. Also, I want to thank the chairman from the other place, Mr. President, for guiding us through this bill in a really expert way. I also want to thank the stakeholders who came to this honorable chamber and presented on the behalf of their sector, of their constituencies. We talked about Barnufo, we talked about Barvin, and everyone knows Mr. Alistair Alexander, as I've said in these chambers before, who was in the vineyard long time ago with his father. We also had the person from the various ministries who came and represented very well on behalf of their various ministries. But Mr. President, at the core of this report is the decriminalization of vending. As the leader of government business alluded to, vendors were seen as second-class citizens in this country. Mr. President, I remember as a student of St. Matthew's School, the vendors who were there came from Lear's Gap, they came from St. Joseph, you know, in the surrounding communities, Mr. President, and they would look out for us students at St. Matthew's School. And again, we talk about these vendors in a different way that we would speak of other professions. But these vendors are at the core entrepreneurs. Because they were not recognized as such, we did not see them as such, but they also played an integral role in the society in terms of, especially the ones who worked at schools, Mr. President. And I could say to you that my children went to Luther Thorne, and Senator Sands will tell you because he was a student there too. And there was a particular vendor there, I think her name is Dillis, And she always looked out for the children, and she particularly was very fond of my daughter, who subsequently passed for Harrison College. And I remember at the graduation, she gave her a gift. And I think Dilys is still working at Luther Thorne School. And I would say to you that they have played a big role in building up our society, building up this society. And you would find, and you would notice it, it's something I would have noticed, that we all came up in a house with a shed roof, as we call them, a little kitchen and a shed roof. And these vendors, you would see them in terms of from that little tray, Mr. President, they would start building round and building round and building round. You know, sometimes we just move into the front house while they start to build around the back. It might take a few years, because at that time, Mr. President, those vendors would not be eligible for bank loans. And the banks, as you know, would have been very hostile then. Some of them are still very hostile today. And they would not have afforded those vendors bank loans. And those vendors built up their communities, and they built their homes, and they finished their homes and not be saddled with mortgages like some of us are today. And we have to really praise them for they are in fact builders of our society. At the core as well of this bill, Mr. President, is the whole concept of vending zones. I'm sure, Mr. President, many of you would have seen since the COVID-19 pandemic, the proliferation of vendors on the highways. And there are so many vendors now on the highways, Mr. President, that it can sometimes be very dangerous to both themselves as well as their customers with the oncoming traffic along the highways. When we were in the sessions discussing the whole question of vending zones, and I would also like to single out Mr. Mark Cummins, who was the previous chief town planner, and he is now PS in the Ministry of Public Works. When we were identifying the zones, and he knows these areas very well, and his contribution was really excellent, Mr. President, I was thinking just past Koiman, going in the direction of the airport, that they can be established as a vending zone where you can actually come off the highway. You can build it out somewhat similar to Oystins, where you have the vendors. You can have the coconut vendors, you can have the fruit and vegetable vendors, you can have an entertainment area, and of course, within these vending zones, Mr. President, we need to put in amenities. Amenities must be crucial as we decide to build out these vending zones. And amenities such as bathroom facilities, and you can have a whole set of bathroom facilities, Wi-Fi, lunchrooms, big screen TVs. You know, because we are talking about actually merging the vending community with tourism. You can get then those big tour buses deviating off the highway where they can safely park and experience what these vendors have to offer. So it can also be an improvement to Oystins, but they have set the standard, as you would know, Mr. President, and they can operate at night, and we can put in lighting and make it a whole experience, because some of them start very early in the morning and they can go late at night like Oystins. And I think that in building out these vending zones, this is what we have to do. One of the other things that I would like to see happen, when each and every one of us approach vendors, we should take the COVID-19 protocols, Mr. President, into consideration. Because sometimes you see people, like there's a vendor on the highway who sells pears, and everybody come touching up and feeling up the pears. You should have your hands sanitized, Mr. President, before you touch anything on a vendor's tray. Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm not a medical doctor, but I know part of the protocol say your hands should be sanitized. And I'm urging all vendors out there, make sure that you have sanitizer to spray the hands of your clients as they approach your trays. Because I believe, I don't know, maybe in terms of the touch, how these things can pass on to other customers who then come and touch the same items that you're touching up. So I believe it is very critical going forward in terms of these vending zones, and they do not necessarily have to be individual units. I haven't seen the ones in the new Bridgetown Market yet, opposite the new Golden Square Park. But I would like to see a situation, as I said, you know, where they will have good restrooms in these vending zones, because we're moving now to the next level in terms of the whole decriminalization process, Mr. President. So I think that we should take it the whole, you know, the whole mile, and make sure that these, especially the ones off the highways, that they will be constructed in such a way not to impede traffic, but when the traffic deviate, they can come back on and filter back on the highway safely. Mr. President, the other thing that came up in the sessions was also the whole question of itinerant vendors. And itinerant vendors would be those persons, as you know, sir, who move from place to place, selling whether it is clothes, materials, food, and everything going around. So the question is, the bill then had to be amended, because our chief parliamentary counsel was here, to include the itinerant vendors. I think Ambassador Commission would have been the one who brought up the whole question of itinerant vendors. So all these things we had taken into consideration, Mr. President, in discussing these bills, this report that is before this honorable chamber. And also, as well, our National Vending Committee, Mr. President, has also been set up. So this bill, in terms of this report, in terms of everything that we wanted to do, we examine everything that surrounds vending. Because as you know, the medical profession is regulated, the accountants are regulated, all these lawyers are regulated, so why not vendors? So it's not that you're discriminating against this class of persons, sir. I wish that we can soon be discussing regulation of the public service vehicles too. But Mr. President, the vendors themselves, they need this committee, and that we can oversee what is happening with our, within the whole vending committee. And of course, vendors who are aggrieved, they have the process to be able to appeal. They have the appeal process that they can go to. So, for an example, a policeman just can't come and say, listen, you, move and keep moving. That can't happen anymore under this bill. And I know that used to happen. I remember the mass confusion that used to happen in Bridgetown, along that bridge there, right there by the bus stand. A whole set of vendors, the police come up to them and tell them, we've got to move now. And the people got to snatch up their trays and move, and and then all their produce, Mr. President, is destroyed. So now, if you want to relocate a vendor, you have to give that vendor 30 days notice. You just can't come up and say move and keep moving. Not in this new republic, Mr. President. We have to change things. And this is one of the major changes that Barbados will see in this new republic going forward. We are looking to do better, Mr. President, for the citizens of this country. And vendors are important constituents, Mr. President, in this new Parliamentary Republic of Barbados. So we're not saying, as the leader of government business stated, that they are perfect. They're not perfect. Because if they commit any wrongdoing, they will be subject to penalties on this bill that we are debating now. They will be subject to penalties. So they can't just do as they like. On the other hand, as I said, there must be some sort of regulation. Okay, this is not a banana republic where you can do as you like and say as you like. There must be regulation. So we're saying that there's a maximum penalty of $500. It was up to $15, and it was discussed that that was too high. And you have to give them some time in order to pay these penalties, Mr. President. So you just can't determine that, okay, move and you've got to pay a penalty. The other thing I want to say is that in terms of their produce, Mr. President, they have to have an inventory. Because obviously, to be able to function as a vendor, you must have a license, okay? So you must have, so you can be asked to present your license to officialdom when they come to ask for your license, to make sure that the license is in order and that you are a legitimate vendor. Also, if you have to move, for whatever reason, you take an inventory of the produce and so on that you have there, so that in the event of anything, you know what you have and you can make a claim to sue. Earlier on, Mr. President, I spoke to the fact that the vendors are in fact entrepreneurs. I do believe, sir, that a scheme like the Youth Entrepreneur Scheme, yes, I know they say from idea to enterprise, which is their slogan, but there must be a relevant agency who can teach a lot of the vendors the rudiments of business. And I say that because, as you recognize, that during the pandemic, a lot of self-employed people were penniless, and there was a serious run on the national insurance scheme, Mr. President. So if these vendors as entrepreneurs, because as you know what BARVEN means, Barbados Association of Retailers, Vendors, and Entrepreneurs, they are entrepreneurs, they would have to pay national insurance and PAYE into government. And they should be taught that. So I believe that yes, or any other government agency, when we have the, the full committees and everything up and running, and we have a full list of all those persons who will be issued licenses and who have licenses, that they must be told that they have to pay into the national insurance. Because you never know when another pandemic is going to hit the world. And COVID-19 has been very severe on the purses of the government. I mean, the government would have assisted self-employed persons during the pandemic earlier this year. But I believe once you're self-employed as an entrepreneur, you should pay your statutory obligations. Go to national insurance and register, because it is not only for a rainy day, but that national insurance scheme, Mr. President, will also assist the vendors and their families at the time of retirement. So I think that that is one of the areas that they are going to have to look at. So, Mr. President, as a member of the Joint Select Committee discussing this whole bill on vending, I commend it to the House, and I do offer my support for it going forward in this new Republic of Barbados. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Wiggins. Speaking? Okay. Senator Hunt.
Thank you, sir. I wish to congratulate the government for the prioritization that it has given to making this piece of legislation the first piece that we are dealing with as a republic. I participated as a member of the Joint Select Committee that worked on this bill. And my experience working as part of the Joint Select Committee was a positive one. The committee was chaired well, I would say. It allowed for joint work between the two houses of parliament. We had the involvement of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's office, the involvement of stakeholders whose daily lives will be impacted by the workings of the legislation, and who therefore appropriately, through their respective contributions to the committee's work, impacted on the letter of the law and to the clarification of the ethos with which we expect this law to be applied. In fact, the methodology that we use of the Joint Select Committee, I think it very well exemplifies how Barbadians will want to be engaged going forward in matters of this level of importance that have a direct impact on their lives. And I hope and look forward to this type of approach being the one we use when we soon direct our efforts to settle in the terms of the Constitution, which will guide us on our next step of nationhood. I think if faced with the state of vendors historically, as it has been historically in Barbados, there's a reference to Jesus that I think, if you apply it to the state of vendors in Barbados, one where he said that the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have the nests, but the vendors of Barbados have had nowhere to ply their trade free from harassment. So the starting point for vendors in Barbados was a point of not having a safe space to earn a living for themselves, for their family. Unfortunately, sometimes laws can create criminals or criminality. But fortunately, there are occasions like this one where through the law we can correct mistakes of the past. And the vendors of Barbados, they deserve this type of support. Last year, when we had to go into national shutdowns, and then we did the phased relaxation of shutdowns, and citizens needed to get food, and healthy food, healthier food in particular. The vendors were there for us, by and large. Even now, when you think about what is going to be required, or what is currently required of all of us, in keeping ourselves as safe as we can, we're re-emphasizing sticking to the basics, basic hygiene, for instance, hand washing constantly. If you purchase food from a vendor, the good thing I've noticed, which I think they deserve kudos for, is that they sell you the food and they provide you with utensils with which to consume that meal. Whereas other entities, much larger, much more profitable, on a daily basis have people in a position where if they forget to request, especially to be provided with eating utensils, they have to eat with their hands. And in the context of the current affairs, the current environment we're operating in, a lot better can be done. So our vendors who do better than bigger food entities, they deserve kudos for that. Some time ago, we met here and we were discussing a bill to vest lands, Evans Glengarry prisons. And I noticed that quite a few of my fellow senators had what I will call prison stories. Stories with respect to the prison sweetbread. My sweetbread story is based on my grandmother's sweetbread. My grandmother who was a vendor. My grandmother who took me to Spikestown with her on a weekly basis. As she engaged in selling the food crops that we grew at home. And she was part of a community of mostly women who are all hardworking and enterprises, who occupied positions in Spikestown, primarily on the sidewalks outside of certain stores. And unlike the scenes that would be shown on TV or on the newspaper from time to time, the experience of the Spikestown vendors was not like the experience of the Bridgetown-based vendors. As a child, I did notice that sometimes the police would come and doing their jobs, and the vendors, like my grandmother, would take their big aprons and cover their trays and carry on conversations with each other until the police would come, ask them how they're doing, and move on. Then business would continue. So that we are at a point where we are saying that we recognize the importance of our vendors, and we recognize the importance of allowing them to participate, to continue to participate in the economic space free of harassment. This is a day that we should remember as a day we are correcting the wrongs of the past. This legislation provides a set of rights to vendors. And I'm encouraged by the fact that among these rights referred to is the right to sell free of harassment and persecution. The Member of Parliament for St. Peter, when he contributed to debate in the other place, debate on this bill, he remarked that he was speaking of we, the people of the North, that we have an acceptance or expectation even that the vendors of the North, in Spikestown in particular, will occupy the sidewalks, and that he hoped that there would therefore be some consideration when there's a setting out of vending zones to balance in the need to create order as the legislation is intended. But balancing that, if we need to maintain some of the character of certain locations where vending takes place, like in Spikestown. And that is a sentiment that I support. I join him in supporting. But as far as the enfranchisement of vendors goes, there are some things which I would like to see us do. Having been disenfranchised for such a long time, now being given certain rights which are going to come with responsibilities. I think there's going to be the need for some hand-holding to be done, at least for the initial part of the new era for vendors. Vendors have the right to access a process to air grievances with respect to any administrative action that they may face. To make this a meaningful right or ability possessed by the vendors, I think that we need to make sure that there's sufficient training provided for them so that they understand the avenues that they have and so that they are able properly to utilize them if necessary. I think that there should also be some efforts made to build on what I think is the significant work that has been done so far by Senator McConney. And as far as access to electronic commerce, I would like to see, as I have seen and experienced in parts of Africa and parts of Europe, where you can go to a vendor and the vendor equipped with some attachment on their phone facilitate electronic payment. It makes them less of a target for being robbed. It sets up a record that the banks can see that here is a business person, here is some tangible evidence of their income. It puts the vendor in a position where they can access credit and they can be thinking on a scale larger than the scale which they most likely have been thinking on up to this point. That people who vend have traditionally been regarded as members of what used to be called the informal economy. I think there's a new term for that now. The third sector. I would love to see efforts to incorporate them into mainstream commercial thought. And that is especially important, I think, because I do not like to see that people who have been vendors, they reach a certain age, and then they have to depend on the munificence of government for a non-contributory pension. I do not know, frankly, if there will be such a thing in the future as a non-contributory pension. But I think that effort should be made to incorporate those who vend into the social security network. As a person who has had a significant degree of investment being made into me by vendors, and I say that because while sitting in Spikestown on the steps with my grandmother and her contemporaries, I had a lot of lessons there. I learned what they call reckon quickly in my head, which helped me at school. I learned that our people can cooperate with each other, because having to get up at a certain time to catch a bus to get back to St. Andrew, sometimes all of what was brought down to be sold was not sold. And what I would see happen, some of the other ladies next to her would say, leave them with us, we will sell them for you. And whenever she went back, it was never a problem. You know, they didn't see her, they didn't see each other as competition. And that is a type of capitalism, do I call it complementary capitalism, that I've seen exhibited, seen practiced by the vendors. The focus being to satisfy their customers with whom they have high quality relationships. I've seen that need, that preference to satisfy the customer and to be helpful supersedes the need to be profitable. And I think that is a good example for our people as far as how we are capable of doing business. So today, I want to assert my unreserved support for this legislation, and I'm obliged to, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Hunt. It's on to Senator Greenwich.
Thank you, Mr. President. I could not allow this debate on vending to take place in this chamber without making a contribution to it. And I say that, sir, because I am a product of vending. Yeah, they sold me. Mr. President, I say that because the early part of my life was totally indebted to vending. My grandmother was a vendor, and I had 3 aunts who were vendors as well. And I can stand here in this chamber and say proudly that the keiki that I wore to school in Crampton Street, the shoes that I wore, the books that I used, were all provided by vendors. The lunch money I spent when I was a schoolboy, everything had the origins in the business of vending. My grandmother and my aunts never spoke about vending. I don't know if they ever heard the word. They always called themselves hawkers. And I will be the first to admit that there wasn't a lot of glamour in that business at the time. But I was very proud of them. Indeed, only a few, but there ago, one of the youngest members of my family was told to shout and tell me, "I'm proud of you, man. I hear about you. I'm proud of you." And I told them, and I'll say, no, they can never be as proud of me as I was of my aunts and my grandmother. For me, Mr. President, this particular bill is about the very foundation of the parish of St. Philip. Sir, every district that I know of in St. Philip, when I was at school, there were about 8 or 10 ladies who were vendors in each of those districts. And I speak, sir, of districts like Bayfield and Bladesill and Marley Vale and East Point. I speak of districts like Merricks and Wellhouse. Districts, sir, like Long Bay and Ruby. Districts like Vineyard and Lucas Street and Duncan's. All of those districts had about 8 or 10 ladies who were vendors. And sir, one of the things I admired most about them was their work ethics. So they caught no bus on mornings later than the 5 o'clock bus from Bayfield. The very first bus to leave Bayfield, those vendors were on that bus. And so they came home no earlier than the very last bus to leave the bus stand. And I recall, sir, when they were leaving the bus stand, when the last bus was 6 o'clock. Then it went to 7, 8, 9, and so on. But whichever bus was the last bus, those vendors caught that particular bus. I can tell you one thing about them. There was a kind of camaraderie between those vendors. When they spoke to each other and asked each other on evenings how each one of them got through. And they would all say, some would say I sell out, some would say I didn't do so well, and so on. And one thing I remember about them too, they were very God-fearing people. And nearly every Sunday they dressed up and they went to church. And they hugged one another and they chatted. I remember those days. And I say once again how proud I was of my grandmother and my aunts. I remember too, Mr. President, the days when I was playing, I was a sportsman at school. Cricket, practicing cricket, playing set matches, and doing all those things. Athletics. And I recall the number of occasions when I had to take the last bus like them. I remember the number of evenings that I would be there sitting down in the bus saying, thanks be to God, I'm here now. I'm so tired. I'm going to rest my feet. And just as the bus was about to move off, my grandmother would turn up with that big basket. And it was always my lot to get up and give her the seat. And I would stand for the rest of the journey. So proud of that woman. And there were some evenings too, I recall that. When she came to that bus, she was drenched with rain. Because one thing, it was the last bus. And whether it was raining or not, she had to get there in time or she would have been left. And she would get there drenched with rain. She couldn't afford to be left. I am a product of vending, and I could talk about it. You see, sir, vending was seen by this particular group of hawkers as their first and their only step towards financial independence. And it was a travesty that the powers that be at the time did not encourage them. The plantation owners tried very hard to stifle their progress because the plantation owners still wanted us, still wanted everybody, still wanted our foreparents to behold to them foreground provisions and so forth. The plantation owners and the legislators of the day did not support the commercial ambition of our foreparents. They tried to choke their drive and their enterprise at each and every turn. You know, sir, in today's Barbados, many are demanding, that the smoking of marijuana be decriminalized, that it would not be seen any longer as a crime. And in similar vein, I had asked the question as to why was it that the selling of products over the bridge, provisions over the bridge, was considered to be a crime and was confirmed to be a crime. There should never have been a criminal sanction for vending. And I speak the same here too, sir, of something like wandering. Wandering, I should have said, not wandering, but wandering. You know how many young fellas I met when I used to go by Dodds, by GIS, to play cricket and so on. And you ask those young boys, why are you in here? And you know what? 9 out of 10 of them would say, I wouldn't go as far as 9 out of 10, about 6 out of 10, would say, for wandering. Wandering. Now, here we have a situation. So you talk to them, and they would tell you, my mommy and daddy used to be always fighting at home in the house. And I had to run out. I had to get away. And you know that the reason why that fellow is in there is because of what was happening home in the house that he was getting away from. But he ended up in the government industrial school for wandering, for getting out of it. And we did not even think to look at the source, at the problem, and say, let us try to see if we can put this house right. No. The house continued to be in total disarray, and the fellow ended up in Dodds. And when we should have gone at the source, You know, sir, if you were convicted for vending on the streets or on places where you should not have been, in 3 instances, let us say, 3 instances, and let's even say my grandmother, 3 instances for selling where she should not be selling, that made her a habitual criminal. You can imagine that? Because she had the same record as anybody who had 3 convictions. So she had that designation of a convicted. For what? For selling. For selling. Sir, if you know how a criminal card is written up, you put the date, the offense you commit, and so on. 1, 2, 3. And that is what happened to so many of those hawkers. I wonder, sir, who were the legislators at the time and what they were thinking about and what they were thinking when they made those laws. Because just imagine that in the days I'm speaking of, Mr. President, those days, it was where you were selling, that made you a criminal, you know. It was not what you were selling that made you a criminal. It was where you were selling that made you a criminal. Because what you were actually selling was not illegal. It was not illegal. You know, sir, very often you were selling produce which you had bought to sell, or produce which you had cultivated yourself. Your own produce. There you have 3 convictions. Habitual criminal. Sir, a lot of our social problems at that time were given lip service. And the solutions to those problems were very often just what we would call today skin deep. But, as the speakers before me have said, this is progressive legislation. What was there before, sir, was archaic in the true sense of the word. And more appropriately now, sir, this is also corrective legislation. And it is my view, Mr. President, that we've taken too long, far too long, to right this particular wrong. Mr. President, we must shoulder some of the blame. This was indeed a neglected area. And I wholeheartedly agree with Section 36. I don't know if I can put my hand on it quickly. But that is the section that says that the convictions should be expunged. And I'm having some difficulty, sir. I'm not as young as I used to be. Yes, Section 36, here's it. One of the best sections. The record of any sentence of a person convicted of an offense of selling or offering or exposing for sale of goods, wares, or merchandise in a public place, on a street, a lane, an alley, a road, a highway, a beach, or within the curtilage of that person's residence without a license, permit, or other similar document under any enactment shall be deemed to be expunged with effect from the commencement of this act. Couldn't want a better section than that. Couldn't want a better section. Those who have a criminal record for vending will now have that record expunged. But I say, sir, that it is a pity that the amendment did not come at a time when the majority of those who were the victims would have been alive, those who were so embarrassed. It's a pity that we'll wait till poor Granny has gone to her grave to tell me now it is expunged. It's a travesty. Because right thinking Barbadians, sir, now know that there is value to each and every honest job. Sir, I do not agree with, and I heard this from about 2 or so persons who spoke on the bill, that, not here, not in the Senate, no, that the vendor's license fee should be abolished altogether. I've heard that. I do not agree with it. I like the idea of having a license fee, even if it is a nominal. In fact, I approve of it being just a nominal fee of a few cents, a few dollars. I do not think, sir, it should be a profit-making fee for government. I don't think so at all. I think that the license fee should not be prohibitive in any way. But there should still be a regulatory regime in vending, because there has to be order in vending. And I think that one of the ways in maintaining and ensuring that there is some control is to use the licensing method. Because there may come a time when you may want to cap the number of persons who are into vending, because you may want to cap it. You never know. I mean, it might be overflowing on the streets. You never know. You may want to cap it. So, Mr. President, I agree that that should still be in place. like other people have said too, Mr. President, and this is where perhaps the tone of my presentation will be a bit different. Because I too believe that with all of these rights and all of the accolades and so on that we are giving to the vendors, that we have to remind them that they have certain responsibilities as well. So when in the other place you glorify the vendors, and when in the Senate we big up the vendors and so on, I want to make it clear that we are not speaking of those vendors who still persist in pre-deal larceny. We are not bigging up those. In fact, we are telling them that we do not approve of what you are doing. And we are not bigging up those ones either who stand in front of, well, a client of mine had to be complaining quite recently in Swan Street and blocking the door, blocking the entrance to the store. And then when that vendor was spoken to, the vendor's response was, "You got money ready, what more you want?" That is the way he spoke to the owner of the store. I'm not bigging up that vendor either. Because the client had told me that customers were even scared to say, "Excuse me," to that vendor in order to get into his store. So you could very well imagine. I am not bigging up the one who runs down the road in Swan Street or wherever behind you without a mask on his face saying, you know, "Dads, buy something from me." They always call you dads. "Dads, buy something from me." I'm not bigging up that fella either. Because they have to realize that, yes, this legislation is something in their favor, but they have responsibilities too. Nor am I bigging up the one who rents a stall from government for $40 a month and then sublets it to somebody else for $400. If you know that you don't want the stall, you give it back to government. Those are not the ones we're bigging up. So yes, there comes a time when you speak with a different tone. We must not lose sight of the responsibilities of the vendors. So there's a rule in drafting when you're drafting law. And that rule says that when you're drafting legislation, you must always bear in mind the mischief that you are trying to cure. What mischief are you trying to cure as you draft, as you write the legislation? That is what is foremost in your mind. But the rule goes on to say, Mr. President, that you must never close your eyes to any other mischief which you may be creating at the same time. So you may go backward, you may go overboard. So yes, we may not want vending to be a crime, but at the same time, we do not want it to be entire chaos. Mr. President, this is not the only piece of legislation which will govern the behavior of vendors. Do not believe for one moment that vendors are now exempt or immune or relieved or excused from those laws which all Barbadians must still observe. A coconut vendor, sir, who leaves the coconut shells by the roadside can still be charged for littering. Do not think that you get away with every single thing, vendors. There are still certain responsibilities that you have to shoulder. A vendor that uses insulting language a police officer in uniform can still be charged with that offense. So do not think that automatically you can do as you like. You know, so there's a saying that all of us have heard at some point, at some stage. We who are not lawyers have heard it. We who are lawyers have heard it. That saying is, the law is an ass. We've heard that. But, sir, that may be true. The law may very well be. But one thing I can tell you about the law is that it is not asinine. It is not asinine. This legislation does not make Barbados a free zone for vendors. It does not make this island a free zone for vendors. Vendors must still have, they have to realize that they must still have a license. And that if they sell food, that they must still have a health certificate, that is necessary. Vendors must realize that Barbadians must have a walking space on the sidewalks. Vendors must realize that they will not be allowed to block storefronts, and that certain places will remain off limits for vending. That the show windows of stores should be exposed for customers to see what the store owner is offering. Because there are still vending regulations and regimes that must still be adhered to. Vendors themselves, Mr. President, must help in sending the message that Barbados is not disorganized. We are not a disorganized place. And we hope that this legislation does not send a message to others, you know, that to vendors that they can sell anywhere. That the police can't do me anything. That more people just pass here than pass there, so I going over there, nobody can stop me. Especially now, sir, that as so many have remarked that nowadays, if you just look at the highway, you will see how many of them are gradually converging there. So, sir, the same way that we can organize vendors in the markets, we must be able to organize them by the wayside. So the message has to go out, Mr. President, that we are not a place where anything goes, and that where vending is concerned, there must be still law and order. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Greenwich. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, thank you. I rise on this occasion to support the bill, both in my capacity as an ordinary citizen who came from a regular home, perhaps not among vendors, but I was raised in St. George, surrounded by vendors and farmers, and they took their produce to the roadside and to vendors' markets down in the glebe throughout the week. And on Saturday mornings, on any given street corner, oftentimes across the length and breadth of St. George, where I grew up, you could find vendors. But I rise on this occasion, Mr. President, also as a member of the Joint Select Committee on the vending bill, and to speak on three main issues. I wish, first of all, to commend the bill, commend the chairman of the Joint Select Committee, the Minister with responsibility for small business, commerce, and industry in the country and energy, and the previous minister with whom this work started, the Honorable Dwight Sutherland, and all of the members of the committee. From here in the Senate, we had Senator Althea Wiggins, Senator Dr. Lynette Holder, Senator Damian Sands, and myself from this chamber. We had a series of meetings, Mr. President, and we spoke with a number of stakeholder groups who attended all of the meetings, Mr. President. And there were a number of things that were raised during the course of those discussions. And it is on the basis of those discussions, Mr. President, that I would wish my comments to be framed around three broad areas. One, inclusion versus exclusion, the social investment that this represents, Mr. President. The second thematic area is building opportunity and supporting evolution of our people. And the third one, Mr. President, is transforming commerce and promoting trade. Now, Mr. President, this is the first bill that this Senate is considering in the period in the immediate post-transition to Republican status. The very last item that was on this agenda, Mr. President, was the adoption of our charter, which said who we were, and it captured the values of the new republic. Mr. President, I want to spend a few moments speaking about what that charter represented, some of the issues that are captured there, and how it dovetails with the bill that is before us today. Mr. President, in the first instance, we speak in great detail in the charter for the Republican transition process of the question of ensuring enfranchisement of our people. In the preambular section, we begin in the very first sentence of the preamble, Mr. President, by speaking about the fact that we underscore the sanctity of the pledges that we make to one another, ensuring a peace, just and equitable Barbados, whose well-being is grounded in the enfranchisement of all citizens. That is the first element, Mr. President. And then it goes on to say this: conscious that the work of dismantling past and present inequities and the building and sustaining of strong communities in their place requires us to confront legislatively, morally, and sensibly the problems and difficulties faced by our most vulnerable citizens through our daily choices and actions. Mr. President, this piece of legislation, decriminalizing vending across this country, giving ordinary working class Barbadians their due, and making them feel as though they are in fact a valued part of our society, is reflective of this very paragraph of the last item of business on our last order of business, our last sitting before we became a republic. And so it is fitting that today we are having a conversation on the decriminalization of vending and passing of an entire bill which speaks to that. Mr. President, that is the first thematic area that I want to treat to, and it talks about inclusion versus exclusion, ensuring that people feel as though they have a just stake, a viable stake. There's a sense of belonging to your community. Mr. President, I have spoken on more than one occasion at great length in every possible forum without apology for the fact that our system, in the way it has been structured historically, not just for vending, but for people generally, has created a sense of exclusion and not necessarily inclusion. People don't necessarily feel that sense of belonging. From the time people hit 11 years old, we make a declaration to them and to the world: they're either good enough or they're not. They're either first class or they're second class. We celebrate a certain type of excellence and relegate a different type of excellence into the back row of our back rows of our classrooms and into what we would call second chance education. If you didn't get it right the first time, go and come again. Or we create opportunities that you can use your hands and so on. Mr. President, I reject the principle that there is second-class citizenry associated with differentiated skills, differentiated mindsets, Mr. President. And one of the things that this legislation does, which was not in existence before, was to ensure that teenagers, people who are under the age of 18, who under the law cannot contractually engage in relationships for work, are enfranchised under this legislation, and they are recognized as legitimate vendors. It was an extensive discussion in our in the select committee, and I'm very proud to be a part of a legislative framework that recognizes the importance of giving young people who came up, just like Senator Grinnell spoke about, just like Senator Hunt spoke about, seeing their relatives and their ancestors and their forefathers in vending. And just in the same way that there are family members who will always be lawyers, and they have entire families of lawyers, family members who are business people, and they pass on their businesses and historically through generations, the same thing applies to vending, Mr. President. And in the same way that young people go to work, whether we call it an internship, in a professional setting, we are now enabling young people to feel that sense of belonging to vending because we recognize it as a legitimate part of our own development. Now, Mr. President, this is in keeping with the philosophy of this Barbados Labour Party administration. It is in keeping with this philosophy of this government. Mr. President, this is a government that has made announcements on more than one occasion about the importance of inclusion. Some people call them squatters. I had the privilege of leading the legislation, leading the passage of a bill here for the acquisition of land at Rock Hall, Mr. President. We have heard in the other place the discussions on what is going to be taking place in the Bell, for example. People call them squatters. For us, this administration, we call them landless. People don't take up on any given day and go and put their houses on land that doesn't belong to them because they have alternatives. They don't go and stand up, Mr. President, and say, I'm going to build a house or build a home to put a roof over my family's heads because they have alternatives. People make choices because there is a sense of exclusion. And oftentimes there is a disenfranchisement. And this administration has made it a public policy to ensure that there's land for the landless, that there is enfranchisement for those persons who may have had circumstances that led to them having to make certain decisions. They were not necessarily the right decisions under the law, but they were the decisions that they felt they had to make at the time, and this administration has found mechanisms to ensure that those persons can be provided for. Ensuring that during the middle of a pandemic, Mr. President, that the challenges of persons not having access to water resources. This is an administration that made sure that people felt that there was a sense of enfranchisement. Basic provision of rights, lives, and livelihoods. That is the philosophy of the Barbados Labour Party. And sometimes, often, I hear commentary which suggests that nothing has been done, we don't care about people. But, Mr. President, the record speaks for itself. The record is there for all to see. All of the challenges that have been faced by people that have been responded to by this administration, leading up today, for example, Mr. President, with this landmark piece of legislation. The second element that I want to speak on, because I'm not going to spend long today, Mr. President, is on building opportunity and supporting evolution. A big part of our discussion, Mr. President, is ensuring that we can take people from where they were to where they can be. The notion that you have always hustled and you've always been hustling and you will forever hustle is not necessarily creating opportunity and supporting evolution. We have a small business community in this country, Mr. President, who we want to be able to empower and to enfranchise through institutionalized mechanisms that allow for them to evolve beyond small businesses to strong, viable corporate entities. Vendors equally so, Mr. President. The leader of government business has spoken about different countries where vending has taken place on a large scale. It was also mentioned by Senator Althea Wiggins. But equally, Mr. President, I would like to see a Barbados where multiple vendors sitting, standing, vending together, all selling the same things, all buying from the same person, but that there is a cooperative type mechanism that empowers them to, one, in some instances, import directly through established corporate entities that they have created because they're all in the same business. Diversification of their product offering, in some instances based on where they are selling, who they are offering their goods to in terms of the demographic for their clients. And also, Mr. President, setting up structures that empower them to engage with the formal economy. Now, this was a discussion we also had in the committee. There was somewhat of a discussion on what was the definition of the informal sector, the informal economy. And Mr. President, we found ourselves making the point that if I am a vendor and I have no bank account, I have never saved money with a bank or with a credit union, and I want to go and I want to buy a car to transport my items from point A to point B, I don't necessarily have access to credit because I have not engaged with the formal system. We want to be able to ensure that our vendors have access to financing, access to credit, and that they have access to the formal economy and that they are able to benefit from the same advantages that large corporate entities are equally able to benefit from. Thirdly and finally, Mr. President, transforming commerce and promoting trade. This is a linkage to the tourism sector, and I want to connect it to that, Mr. President. I would love to see a Barbados evolve where the concept of vending zones, because that is one of the important, that is the part of the legislation that I do want to focus on today. The other colleagues have spoken in some detail about many of the other important sections that I would have mentioned, but at part 4, it talks about vending zones, Mr. President. And yes, there is an issue with the number of persons who are now on the highway, and in some instances, how that is functioning. But this legislation contemplates at section 13H, a zone designated by the minister on consultation with the National Vending Committee. An entire process is expected to get underway, Mr. President, under the umbrella of the National Vending Committee, which is quite a large body, which represents a large cross-section of stakeholders, to identify locations across the length and breadth of Barbados that can be designated as vending zones. It may mean, Mr. President, that we're not just talking about Oistins, or Old Town, or Speightstown, or the highway, where there may be laybys, but we may be able to see an evolution over time, Mr. President, of different zones being designated all across the country in a way that then promotes the development of designated zones that can be differentiated, including for tourism purposes. Now, the Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc. would have submitted recommendations which outlined a number of possible locations that they would like to see identified for the purpose of tourism development. They included sites in the inland parts of the country close to attractions, and it would be such a phenomenal thing, Mr. President, where visitors to our country, Barbadians alike, are able to go all across the country, and in the same way that if I want to go and find pottery, I can go to the Scotland district. If I want to go and find fish, I can go down to the West Coast. I can go down to Oistins. If I want to find craft, I can go to Pelican Village. All across the country, I would love to be able to see tourism vending sites being developed that are driven by local communities and local vendors offering designated local products made in Barbados, manufactured in Barbados as well, and exported from Barbados both directly and via visitors who are traveling out of the country. There is an opportunity, Mr. President, for vending in its most basic form to be elevated to a tradable sector internationally and across borders. For the vending sector to be integrated into our manufacturing sector, especially when we're developing differentiated products, and for our vending community to be integrated within our financial services sector, where we can develop mechanisms that are earmarked for that kind of activity to allow them the opportunity to expand, to evolve, and to develop into large corporate enterprises. The final point that I wanted to make, Mr. President, having covered the 3 main brief points that I wanted to make, was about the question of the license fee. It was raised in the other place, and Senator Grinnell spoke about it, but in the discussions in the Joint Select Committee, the representatives of the vendors spoke at great length in their own presentations on the licensing fee. And the representatives, I believe, of Barvin in particular, made very strong and powerful comments on this one point. At the time, there was one member of the committee who felt and who introduced the concept of the abolition of the fees, and the representative from Barvin responded in strong terms, and this was what he said. He said, "We do not wish to be seen as though we are asking for handouts. We accept that what is already paid by us is not what is necessarily the equivalent of the services that we benefit from. We want to be seen like legitimate businessmen like everyone else. We want to be seen as entrepreneurs like every other entrepreneur. We want to have the legitimacy, because that is what we deserve, of a genuine business class of people who are doing legitimate business. Those were not his exact words, but that is the thrust. That is the thrust of his comments, Mr. President. They don't want it to be abolished, Mr. President. They don't want handouts. They want to be enabled to be able to do legitimate business like everyone else. And they supported its retention. They made it clear that if it was at a level that was above where they felt it was attainable, then they would say so. And it is on the basis of that, Mr. President, that a number of other measures were put in place. One, the licensing fee was retained. Two, we incorporated the response time from government agencies to ensure that there was a legitimate expectation of how quickly the licensing would be turned around and you would have an answer back on your application for your license. There was also the inclusion of, where there were fines, for instance, that there was the introduction of a time that was longer than was originally contemplated, which gave people an opportunity to pay the fines. They were high enough to be prohibitive and to serve as a disincentive for people doing the wrong thing, but at the same time, they were still allowed to be there for the purpose, they were still allowed to have additional time, 30 days I believe is a period of time, in order to ensure that they can be paid. Under Part 5, Mr. President, the last point that was made earlier was about rights and obligations of vendors. Senator Greenidge spoke about responsibilities, and he spoke about the types of vending that was not being supported here. And I wish to support that point wholeheartedly, Mr. President. We, in drafting this legislation and in working closely with the CPC and the other members of the Joint Select Committee, spoke at great length about the importance of rights and obligations. We have a conversation in this country where everyone is absolutely crystal clear on what are their rights. Everyone knows what is their due, but there is not oftentimes an equal understanding of what responsibilities and obligations go along with those rights. And that is one of the things that we as a country need to have a general conversation around: rights and responsibilities. The two are not exclusive of each other. And equally so, in this legislation, there are rights and obligations for vendors. So you do have a responsibility under the legislation to ensure that you are compliant with your licensing requirements. And so you're submitting your license application, you are having an inventory of goods, so you know what you are selling, you are assigned to a given zone, and you're not necessarily allowed to move from one zone into the next to disadvantage someone else, because we always have to think not only about the individual good, but the collective good. And that is what this legislation does. It also speaks about things like the cleanliness of the vending zone. It speaks about things like ensuring that you are able to have an avoidance of confrontation, not using abusive, insulting, or threatening words. And there was one discussion as well about whether or not there should be the inclusion of the use of alcohol in vending zones. That took quite a lot of time, because obviously consumption of alcohol is very much a Barbadian thing, especially when people are out liming. But the vendors themselves in this instance also made it very clear that they did not wish, especially in the fish markets, which was something that was made clear by Barnufo and by the minister responsible for the fish markets, Minister Kirk Humphrey, that they did not wish, and they currently had it in their existing legislation, that they did not wish to have the consumption of alcohol on the premises during the time of vending, because when people sometimes become inebriated and they're handling the kinds of instruments that are used for boning fish and so on, that you did not want to have that environment in the fish market. And that was something that came specifically from the vendors themselves. In the legislation as well, I wish to raise the issue of seizing or reclaiming of goods in response also to Senator Greenidge. He spoke about those persons who were arrested and removed, but what also happened was that their goods were seized. In this instance, Mr. President, the legislation specifically calls for there to be, one, a notice period that you have to move or be relocated. And secondly, it gives a mechanism for what happens when your goods are seized for you to reclaim those goods within a given time period, and where you feel as though you have been sufficiently aggrieved under the legislation, there is also an appellate process. So, Mr. President, this is transformational legislation that we are here passing today. It sets up not just a legislative framework, but an administrative one as well, because it establishes the National Vending Committee, the National Vending Appeals Tribunal, and it also incorporates a commitment from the respective ministry responsible for the administration of this legislation, Mr. President, to the companion development of a developmental program to go along with the legislation. And so on that basis, Mr. President, I wish to commend the committee, I wish to commend the ministry, I wish to commend all of the stakeholders for this landmark piece of legislation, which I believe is going to transform not just the vending industry in Barbados, but also mindsets towards entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial activity, where people earning a livelihood, earning a living in legitimate ways are not in any way decriminalized or marginalized, but they are embraced as part of the enfranchisement of all citizens of Barbados in this new republic. And with these few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Senator Sands.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to lend my support towards this bill. This bill, Mr. President, quite simply, seeks to establish and create a sense of dignity, pride, industry, and the practice and culture of vending in this country. Now, the history of vending is well documented. From as early as the 1600s, from as far back as the documents have written, vendors have been described as problems, pariah, threats to the economy and business of Barbados, threat to commercial enterprise in Barbados, as far back as the 1600s. In those times, the white merchant elites would do everything in their power to ensure that hard-working, honest street vendors would either be prevented or removed from practicing their trades in commercial centers in Bridgetown. That was the order of the day in those times. Vendors were seen as eyesores. In those times, retailers would call officers of the Crown to have persons removed from operating within the vicinity of their retail shops because they were eyesores. They will not bring business to this area. That was the ideology and the perception of vendors in those times. Vendors were essentially classified as a threat to the economic state of the merchant class in those times. Now, with the passage of time and the development of Barbados to the modern Barbados of today, the stench of the stigmatization of vending still remains. It may not be in the same oppressive nature as it was in the 1600s. It might not even be racially motivated, but the stench, the treatment, the perception of what it meant to be a vendor continue to pass through time. And it is embedded still in the ideology and practices of both governmental and the people and citizens of this country. Now, today, this government, under the New Republic, smells the stench and has made the decision today that not only will it smell it, but it will do something about it, because the stench can be removed, and it will be removed with the passage of this legislation. This bill seeks to lend support to vendors at the highest practicable level possible that government can assist any business or industry in this land. It seeks to ensure that the past wrongs are righted and that the vendors of today are given the national legitimacy that they desire and require in the practice of their trade. At clause 17 of this bill, it clearly states that a vendor has a right now, under this new Republic of Barbados, that a vendor has a right now to carry on the business of vending in accordance with the laws of this country. And not only that, he can carry on that business without fear of harassment or unreasonable impediments. That in itself is significant. This bill establishes those rights for vendors. And so that we understand how significant just that one clause is, I want to create a scenario for you. And this is a real scenario. This is actually things that persons have lived through. Imagine, prior to today, you can be a vendor. You recognize yourself as a vendor. You may or may not have a permit. And you decide that you can no longer stay home and do nothing. And as an honest, hardworking individual, you find some goods, you pay the person, probably take them on consignment or layaway. Consignment, sorry. You take the goods, you go down to an area and seek to play your trade in vending. Unfortunately, as it may be, your permit may not permit you to operate in a specific area you are in. It might be two yards away from the area you are in. Or you may not have a permit at all, but at the end of the day, you're trying to earn to make a living. I'm not justifying what you're doing, but you understand, because at the end of the day, each man here has to live. Now imagine that is your circumstance, and an officer of the Crown either called or so happen to be on the beat and sees you operating outside of your permit or outside of the area you should be vending, and he decides that he's going to tell you have to move. Now, in a situation like that, some persons might respond in the same rough or aggressive manner as the officer of the Crown, and therein lies the problem. A conflict ensues. Maybe the person in an attempt to try to move their goods take too long, and goods get pushed down. Goods are damaged, goods are lost. And on top of that, that same individual, who naturally is not being a nuisance or creating any physical violent offenses, is now charged criminally with an offense for the simple fact that he was vending outside of a permitted area. Essentially, that is the practice, and that has been the practice for many vendors. That has been the experience for many vendors in this country. Trying to earn an honest dollar and wind up before the courts, charged, and have convictions to your name. And now, if you want to go and travel overseas, you want to go apply for a visa, whatever you need to do in your day-to-day life that requires you to get a certificate of character, on that certificate of character, you will now see you have been convicted for something as simple as your vending. That is the nature of Barbados prior to today. Now, with that being said, what I intend to do now, Mr. President, is simply to identify the significant aspects of this bill that seeks to right those wrongs. Now, at clause 17, where it states the rights of vendors, gone are the days now, Mr. President, where you can simply be told at short notice, listen, move from about here, move your things, get from out of here, move. That is no longer going to be the practice once this bill is made law. Vendors will now be entitled, the operative word in the bill, entitled to 30 days notice before the imposition of an eviction notice or a relocation notice. But in respect to the relocation notice, Mr. President, not only are you entitled to the 30 days notice, you're also entitled to be consulted. The person responsible for drafting the notice more than likely would be the manager of vending. That person has to give you not only the 30 days notice, but must consult with you as to why they are seeking to relocate you. So in other words, they just can't wake up and decide, I want so-and-so moved, so they will be moved in 30 days. No. There must be some form of consultation in the process. This arbitrary way of dealing with things, dealing with vendors back from the 1600s is no longer going to be a part of a modern republic in this country. We need to treat people as people and recognize that they need to be respected, even if they may not see or have the same views as the specific person who is managing the situation. There must be respect for all. Now, at 17.4, Mr. President, the Act went further by not just stating that they must be consulted, it actually expresses the intention of what consultation should entail. And at 17.4 of the clause, Mr. President, it states that consulting shall entail that the manager of vending zones shall, within 30 days notice period, write to the vendor stating the reasons for the assignment of the new site or location of his vending business. And the vendor shall respond to the manager of vending zones in writing within the 30-day period, stating his objections to the assignment. So it now instills a right to the vendor that not only must he be consulted, but he can state why he disagrees with the rationale for him being assigned to a new location. But the bill goes further. It also states at clause subset 5 of clause 17 that the statement of reasons by the manager of the vending zones referred to in subsection 4, which I just referenced, shall take into account discussions on the subject of relocation of the vendor with the organizations that represent the interests of the vendor. And that is significant, and I will explain why. The reality is that not all vendors might be academically inclined as others. Not all might be able to express themselves in writing in the same way as others might. I can give you an example. I personally know of a vendor who can count money back, front ways, left ways, sideways. But he is unable to read and write his name. But he knows money well. Taking that type of person or asking them to respond, he might find it a challenge. He might be frustrated with the situation and just throw up his arm to say, you know what, let me do what I want to do regardless and walk away. This specific clause now allows the persons who are equipped to manage these types of situations to step in on his behalf and be able to consult on his behalf, ask questions on his behalf, express his concerns on his behalf. It protects him further. This is not the 1600s anymore. This is a new republic. The ways of dealing with persons have changed and will be changed. That is a significant clause within this new bill, Mr. President. Now, as I highlighted the scenario, the practice prior to today, this new bill entitles vendors to reclaim any merchandise that has been seized or damaged under an eviction or relocation notice. There's also a clause within this bill, Mr. President, that instills an obligation on vendors that should there be a dispute between themselves in the workplace, because if you're being honest and real, it is a reality. You don't get along with everybody that you work with. This now creates a form of dispute resolution. It asks the managing vendor to intervene once it is reported to him and try to resolve it. And again, because this is not the 1600s, should the manager of vending zones decides to make a decision that the person who is aggrieved by it does not agree, they now have the right to appeal it. They now can say, well, I don't agree with you. He's your friend. You just looking to bully me further. So I ain't gonna deal with you anymore. I can appeal above you. I'm gonna go to the persons who will not be prejudiced in this situation, who will not be biased in this situation, and they will get my justice then. That is what is implemented in this new bill. As I mentioned earlier in regards to the seizure of goods, before when goods were damaged or seized, vendors were never quite truly sure as to how they would get back their goods or when they would get back their goods, if at all. Under this bill, vendors are now entitled, once they send in a claim for their goods that were seized, if the goods are perishable, immediately their goods should be released. If they're non-perishable, within 2 business days. That again is significant because people don't find money. I have never seen a money tree. So you seize my goods, and then because I spent all of my money in the initial set of goods that I have to sell to get back my money or to buy new stock. I can't go and buy new stock because you have my goods. I ain't get them sell, they're seized. And then it takes you 3 months to get back to me. That is not fair. That is not fair to hardworking individuals in Barbados. So this bill recognizes that issue and rights the wrong. If you seize my goods, as long as the onus is on me to send in my claim. So as long as I send in my claim, within 2 days, if they are non-perishable, I must have back my goods. And if they are perishable, as soon as you get my claim, please release my goods to me. The bill goes even further than that and states that in the event that the goods are damaged, vendors can now claim compensation for the damaged goods to the value of the goods. So even if the damaged goods, you still will get back your money in your pocket to go and buy new goods. That is something that's very significant. Apart from the rights, Mr. President, that I just highlighted, there's also the creation of a National Vendor Tribunal that will oversee all applications and appeals as it relates to the decision-making of both the minister, the manager of zones, and the commission. So should any of those persons make a decision that the vendors are not in agreement with, they can make an application to the tribunal and have it adjudicated there. Also important, Mr. President, is the fact that, and even the simple application for a permit, this bill sets a timeline of 7 days for the minister or the manager of zones to address the application and make a determination on it. But should the 7-day period pass, no longer will a vendor have to sit and wait and hope that he gets a permit and wonder what's happening with his process. He can now appeal to the same tribunal and ask for them to intervene and find out what is going on. That is something that we created so that it is clear we are serious about the way in which we do business with vendors. Treat vendors the same way we would treat any other business person in this country. So if a timeline is set for 7 days, the vendor should expect a response in 7 days. And if that is not the case, the vendor doesn't have to wait on you. Again, he can go to the tribunal and have his questions answered. Mr. President, those are the most significant rights in the bill that I have noticed, Mr. President. But there's one in particular that I must highlight before I close, Mr. President. And that is the one that seeks to expunge the criminal records for persons who have been convicted while plying their trade as vendors. As I highlighted to you before in the scenario, Mr. President, that has always been the case for persons who seek to reinforce their right to vend. 9 times out of 10, should there be any fracas between a vendor and an officer of the Crown, the unlikely situation would be he would receive a conviction. And that was the history of this country. But now recognizing the wrongs of the past, Mr. President, this government has sought to expunge all of those criminal records. I've heard when it was part of the Joint Select Committee, one person said that there was someone with as many as 20 convictions for vending. That is a man that's been constantly trying to get his goods sold and keeps running afoul of the law. We recognize those issues, Mr. President, and as a result of that, no longer will we be dealing with criminal convictions, we'll now be passing on administrative penalties. Mr. President, in closing, I just want to commend the government for laying before this honorable chamber a bill that will seek to transform the way we treat vendors. It is a landmark bill, Mr. President, and I hope that it passes all stages today, Mr. President, and we can see going forward into tomorrow in this new republic, a new way, a new perspective, a new sense of dignity and pride being restored to the persons who consider themselves to be one of the pillars of this country known as vendors.
Thank you, Senator Sands. Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. President. I could not allow this opportunity to go by and not speak in relation to this very important bill. And sir, as I reflected on the bill and listening to the discussion in this chamber, two words come to mind, sir. Everyone matters. And this bill, sir, is seeking to ensure that a segment of persons in a particular area are no longer marginalized, and that there is the recognition of the importance of vending. We have heard in this chamber, sir, reference made to the manner in which vendors have been treated in the past. And you know, sir, one of the unfortunate aspects is that in many instances, vendors have not been seen as business persons. We have heard, sir, in this chamber, the manner in which vendors have been able to support families. But there must also be the recognition that in many families, and I can think of some, sir, I unfortunately, I am not like some of the other senators, like Senator Hunt or Senator Greenwich, having had members of my family that I'm familiar with, having been involved in vending. But I myself have been in contact with quite a number of vendors. And I do know that, sir, in essence, what vending has been for many of these families really has been a family business. And you, like I, sir, have a familiarity with oysters. We know that there are a number of persons involved in the fishing industry. And the truth is that vending with respect to fishing really has been a family business. And it is not only restricted to that type of activity, but other activities as well. And I think, sir, the reason why this bill is extremely important is because it signals to us that we have to change our mindset as it relates to dealing with vendors. No longer must vending be seen to be on the margins, but vending must be recognized, sir, as an important business element. Sir, you know, if the persons who engage in vending were not participating in such an activity, what would they be doing? You know, sir, that the level of unemployment in Barbados would be higher. So the truth is that vending, seen, sir, as part of the informal sector, does contribute significantly to facilitating jobs for ordinary Barbadians and ordinary men and women. And this legislation, sir, provides the opportunity, which is very important because I spoke of the context of the family business, but it now provides the opportunity for the persons involved in vending to also be transferring the skills and the knowledge to the younger persons as well, and doing it in a legitimate manner. So this bill, sir, is very important. It provides for a certainty with respect to the legal status of those involved in vending. We have heard, sir, in this debate about the issues of harassment. Sir, I remember, maybe for different reasons with respect to the harassment, but I remember issues of persons selling on the bridge. I remember well, sir, Temple Yard. I remember when the Rastafarians functioned, sir, by Norman Center on Broad Street. And that in itself really reflected what Senator Sanders was speaking about in his contribution. And essentially what we are doing is to ensure that this bill creates the, like I said, the legal status and the space. So that we have to recognize, sir, that vendors are entrepreneurs, vendors are business persons. And we have, sir, to embrace this business activity. And it is a business activity, sir, that has been able to improve the standard of living of many Barbadians. And I can think of families, sir, involved in vending, that from that vending business, they've been able to build apartments. They've been able to, in fact, in some instances, even get involved in what we would consider the more established type of businesses. So it is important. I want, sir, to lend my voice as well in support of those who engage in vending to get the appropriate licenses to do so. I think, sir, that is very important. We do have to ensure that we act in accordance with the law and function in accordance with the law. And I know others have spoken to that, and I do not intend to spend very long in relation to that. Sir, Senator Hunt made an observation that I felt was very important. He spoke to the fact that sometimes his grandmother would not have sold all of her items, and she would leave those items with other vendors or hawkers, as would have been described in those times. And what I want to touch on, sir, is the fact that vending in a very serious way relates the Bajan culture and relates some good values as well, and demonstrates that there are some aspects that those of us who function in the formal economy and those who function in society, sir, can do well to take note of. And what Senator Hunt, sir, was referring to was the collaboration, the cooperation, the sharing, the solidarity that existed, sir, amongst the vendors. And I'm very aware that it still exists today. And those are values that we all can embrace in the society. They are worthwhile. And it is a lesson that we can take from our vendors. Of course, sir, I am of the opinion that vendors is in the vendors environment, it's the real culture. It's the real Bajan culture. There's no put on, there's no, you hear the true Bajan words, the good ones and the not so good ones, but you know, sir, that is all part of our culture. And I make reference to that for this reason, because I believe that with vending, there's really the opportunity for the development of tourism attractions. And why do I say the development of tourism attractions? The truth is that the visitor coming to Barbados does not want to see elements that are made up or created and that are not real. The visitor is coming to Barbados for an authentic experience and for an authentic interaction. I've said, sir, in this chamber before, that the reason why Oistins is as successful as it is because it is real. And you have persons who spend thousands of US dollars a night to stay on the West Coast, and they on Friday nights will go to Oistins because they get that opportunity to interact in a real way with Barbadians and get to enjoy the Barbadian cuisine. And I believe, sir, that vending provides that opportunity for there to be further tourism attractions and for the opportunity for our visitors to be able to interact with Barbadians. I did give the commitment, sir, that I would not be very long in my presentation. And I started, I'm going to end, sir, where I started, with respect to everyone matters and the marginalization of vendors and where this piece of legislation seeks to remove that. And where this piece of legislation seeks to recognize that vendors make a meaningful contribution to our society. And where, sir, they are acknowledged as productive members of the society. Sir, everyone matters. And today, I am proud in a Republic, Barbados, to support this piece of legislation, and I believe that it signals well that this is the first piece of legislation we are dealing with, and it signals to Barbadians that we, in this Barbados Labour Party, believe that everyone matters. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Bragg. Senator Nurse. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing me to have this little intervention on this particular bill. I shan't be long. I recognize that I am probably the last speaker on this debate, and so I now stand between lunch break and this. So I shan't be long, but I think I could not let this opportunity pass to also put in my 2 cents worth in this debate, because I think, Mr. President, this is good legislation. This is legislation which I think that all of us in this Senate, in this honorable Senate sitting here today, can be proud to be part of and to support. And I had the opportunity when it was being debated in the other place to hear part of the debate, and also I had an opportunity to tune in during the committee sessions for a part of those deliberations. And I have to say, I learned a lot. I knew, of course, the various issues, broad issues surrounding, vending and so on in the country. But to really have put it into perspective during those debates, to hear the difficulties that our parents, our foreparents, our grandfathers, our grandmothers, and the truth is that those of us who would have come up as baby boomers, and I dare say even millennials, all of us in here, or most of us perhaps, can relate and can connect to the issues surrounding vendors and vending, because we know relatives, we know families, we know friends, we know associates who have been caught up in this sphere of activities, and who would have used this as a means of supporting their families. Children would have gone to school and been able to, and families would have been able to provide uniforms and lunch and books and so on throughout of the revenue of the sales that they would have been able to make from pursuing this operation. And so it is good to know that finally they are able to operate in a legal framework. We wonder, of course, why did it take so long when you hear all of the issues? And we think that since 1966 we have been an independent country. Why did it take so long for legislators to recognize that that it was necessary to regularize and to put in a legal framework the whole system of vending so that vendors are now relieved of some of the fears and some of the concerns which would have surrounded the whole operation in the past. And, you know, just this weekend, as I sat around, it's a ritual that I go through every Saturday morning with my 95-year-old mother, Mr. President, and, you know, sitting down and reminiscing and talking about these little peddling shops, these vendors in the community who were so important to all of us growing up, and who even in some cases, in the case of the little shopkeepers, who allowed people to trust, who allowed them to trust goods and to pay at the end of the week when they got their week's wages. And without and you only come to realize what a significant role they all played in the development of their communities and in keeping them going. And I have to say that I am grateful to some of those vendors because as a product of Combermere School, I remember I remember a particular vendor because they were not allowed to come onto the school premises and sell. There was only one privileged vendor who was actually allowed in the school canteen to set up her little tray and to sell, but the others had to stay on the outskirts of the school. And I very well recall that we were fed by a lot of by those vendors. How much of us in here know what is a pear cutter, for example? We know cheese cutters, of course, but the point is that they did whatever they could to make sure that we schoolboys who only had, at that time, perhaps 10 cents or 25 cents for lunch money, were fed. And even if we didn't have all the money, they still gave us what we wanted. So we just celebrated a new national hero as well. But those people, all of them, those vendors who did so much in helping to build up this Barbados, are also important unsung heroes. And I don't think that any amount of praise is sufficient to recognize their contribution. And they produce people like us who can now come into these parliament, who can now participate internationally in the international bodies across the world, who would have benefited because their parents, because their uncles, because their aunties, and so on, at some point would have recognized the importance of providing them with opportunities to go to a school, to be properly schooled, and they could only afford it through this concept or this opportunity, this exercise of vending. Mr. President, I really endorse a lot of what the debate, what I've heard in the debate, and feel proud to be part of it. What I would like to say, because most of it was articulated. What I would have wished to say, a lot of it was already been articulated, so I'm not going to go through all of it. But what I hope will happen, and others, as I said, have spoken to it, but I want vendors to recognize that there are certain responsibilities attaching to these new rules, which they will need to be very mindful of. I want, for example, to draw our attention to Section 18C(d)(e), which speaks to the obligations which we hope that vendors will take to heart, because we don't want to see an explosion of discarded cartoons, of discarded bits of material, etc., remaining on the streets. But we want vendors to recognize that they are going to have to be an important part of helping to see this environment remain clean and tidy, and they accept that when they finish work on evenings, that they are prepared to tidy up their space, and that they recognize that by so doing, they also will be attracting to themselves even others who, because of the untidy state or otherwise, may not have wished to be able to be coming around and purchasing their product, their produce or their products or whatever it might be that they have on sale. So I think it would be useful. I think there's a lot of work for the Vendors Association, I think, will have to do or should be looking or seeking to do to try to sensitize the membership of the important part they have to play in making sure that our environment remains clean and tidy. And I think that one of the best things that Barvin could do is in association. I'm sure that government or some other organizations would be able to find or should be able to find some resources which could help Barvin in doing the training and in facilitating whatever is necessary, so that these individuals, all of these vendors who we now see on the street, recognize that this is an opportunity to develop themselves and to really generate, and to see what they're doing as a true business that can grow and develop if nurtured in the right way. And I think particularly there's particularly one in the vendor who always comes to mind whenever I pass there. This is in Sandy Lane, a vendor right opposite a food vendor. She's been there for years. This is even before the new Sandy Lane. But in speaking to her, you recognize how happy, how joyful she is in doing what she does. She proudly will let you know that this has allowed her to be able to make quite a comfortable living, quite being able to purchase land and to purchase house and to see herself as a small businesswoman. And I think that is where vendors and vending should see itself going, that you start out at that level, but that you can move on over time. The story is told, and I'm not certain if it is, I'm not certain of all the circumstances, but the story is told of this young boy. His mother was talking to him, probably no more than 10, 11, but she was trying to find out, what would you wish to be when you grow up? And he said he wanted to be a vendor. But of course, I think the parent, the mother was taken back, I suppose, to say the least, disappointed, perhaps. But then he went on to explain, he said, but mommy, you know, I don't really mean that. Even if I have to start out, you know, selling my fruits and so on the street, I see myself as who that eventually I will be importing fruits and vegetables and so on and selling to the other vendors. So the point is, he had a vision of where he could go from vending. He didn't see it as necessarily as remaining on the streets and selling a few things in a tray, but he recognized that he could develop and grow and make it in the business community as a significant player. And that is what I would like to see all of the vendors aspiring to. And so I want to commend the government for finally getting this legislation to this place. I want to commend all those who worked so hard, both at the committee stage and the presentations I heard, for explaining and putting in real context the importance of this activity. And I wish that, as I said before, vendors would see and recognize this as an opportunity to move on and to generate successful business for the legal operations of their businesses. And with those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Senator Walcott.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I first of all want to thank all honorable members on both sides of this chamber for their contributions to this bill and their support. I shall be very brief, if I can borrow a quotation from Senator Nurse, that this is very good legislation. This is legislation that all members of this chamber should be proud of. And with those few words, I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Honorable Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 1, Clauses 1 and 2 stand part.
The question is that Part 1 clauses 1 and 2, stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 2, Clause 3.
Chairman, I beg to move that Part 2, Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that Part 2, Clause 3, stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 3, Clauses 4 to 12.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 3, Clauses 4 to 12 stand part.
The question is that Part 3, Clauses 4 to 12, stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 5, Clauses 13. Part 4, Clauses 13 through 16.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 4, Clauses 13 to 16 stand part.
The question is that Part 4, Clauses 13 to 16, stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 5, Clauses 17 and 18.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 5, Clauses 17 and 18 stand part.
The question is that Part 5, Clauses 17 and 18 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 6, Clauses 19 and 20.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 6, Clauses 19 and 20 stand part.
The question is that Part 6, Clauses 19 and 20 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 7, Clauses 21 and 22.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 7, Clauses 21 and 22 stand part.
The question is that Part 7, Clauses 21 and 22 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 8, Clauses 23 to 27.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 8, Clauses 23 to 27 stand part.
The question is that Part 8, Clauses 23 to 27 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 9, Clauses 28 to 31.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 9, Clauses 28 to 31 stand part.
The question is that Part 9, Clauses 28 to 31 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 10, Clauses 32 to 38.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 10, Clauses 32 to 38 stand part.
The question is that Part 10, Clauses 32 to 38 stand part. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
First schedule.
Beg to move that the first schedule be a schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be the schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Beg to move that the second schedule be a schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The third schedule.
Beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The fourth schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Fifth schedule.
Chairman, I beg to move that the fifth schedule be the fifth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the fifth schedule be the fifth schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Sixth schedule.
Chairman, I beg to move that the sixth schedule be the sixth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the sixth schedule be the sixth schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Seventh schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the seventh schedule be the seventh schedule to the bill.
The question is that the seventh schedule be the seventh schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The eighth schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the eighth schedule be the eighth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the eighth schedule be the eighth schedule to the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be now read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the National Vending Act 2021.
The question is that this bill be now passed and be cited as the National Vending Act 2021. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now so passed and so cited. Senator Walters.
Mr. President, this brings us to the end of our business for today, and I beg to move that this sitting be now adjourned until Wednesday, the 8th of December.
The question is that
At 11 o'clock.
question is that the Senate be now adjourned until Wednesday, December 8th at 11 a.m. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate now stands adjourned.